right. The mood is set. Beggar's Canyon is open for business. I got my mug. Brian's got his mug in the background, sheepishly present with us. Why don't you act like you care?
Well, I've got this one and that one in the back. I've got two.
Yep. Well, this one holds more liquid. I don't know why you wouldn't use this one. And we're in a cantina. Why would you use a small wimpy mug like that?
I'm not using either one. They're just decorations.
Oh, so you don't even use them. How do you?
No, I'm drinking out of this. So.
Oh, wow. You don't even pour it in your mugs.
Straight out of the plastic.
All right. Well, all the microplastics going right inside. Well, welcome. I don't have anything in mine either, but that's not because I don't drink out of mugs. It's just because I finished it. But welcome, everybody. Good to see you, but not see you. It's good for you to see us. Is that weird? People should start podcasts like that. Like, oh, it's nice to have everyone see me today. So that's how I'm going to open this up. Today we're talking about polygamy. We're talking about polygamy and how those today might argue that polygamy is still something that we should do as Christians in the new covenant. How polygamy hasn't gone away; we should still do it, and they're going to argue using the Old Testament, I guess the New Testament as well. But we're also going to talk about. And before you turn this video off, because you might say, look, we already know
polygamy bad.
Polygamy bad. I don't need to watch this. I think it goes a little deeper, because if you actually believe polygamy is wrong, there's other things that come into play here, like divorce from marriage, and how that plays into this polygamy argument. Because if we're consistent that polygamy is wrong, and it is one man and one woman, then this is going to have deeper. It's going to go a little bit deeper than just the polygamy bad argument.
Well, and like all things, if you don't have an argument for it and it's just like, ooh, gross, I don't like that, traditionally bad, then the next generation is going to believe it and think it's okay. And that's where we're really going, because in fact, no one does talk about it and why it's unbiblical. And so now you have all these guys rising up, and some of them are in the Hebrew roots movement, and you kind of expect it.
Sure.
But they're rising up now and saying, you know what? We've got some problems that polygamy would, and polygamy or polygamy both would address. Polygyny. Sorry, I'm caught up on the Greek, the polygune. But we have issues that it would address, right? Because you've got women who are basically, they're not being faithful. You've got women who are being picky, or they're delaying marriage and all that sort of thing. And you've got wives then withholding sex from their husbands, or, you know, any of that. And it's like, you know, well, this would solve that problem in the mind of these people. If we could just have more than one woman.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting, because obviously the arguments for having more than one wife are going to come from the Old Testament, but if we look through Genesis through Exodus, I guess. Well, Genesis, all of Genesis into Exodus, didn't everyone mentioned in Genesis only have one wife? I'm pretty sure Adam had no.
No.
Well, Adam had Eve, right? Noah had one wife. His sons had one wife.
So Lamech in Cain's line is the first one that takes a couple wives.
Aiden,
oh, yeah, right.
Yeah, and then Abraham has more than one. Obviously, not Isaac, but Jacob has more than one. Joseph has more than one. So most of the patriarchs have more than one.
But initially they don't. Like, okay, so. You said Lamech, right? Lamech.
Well, Jacob initially kind of has both, but
so like it's the wicked line of Cain that initially had more than one wife, right?
Yeah. But then you do have the patriarchs or whatever that have it. Obviously, the establishment of marriage is in Genesis 2, and that's where Jesus goes or whatever. But these guys try to make the argument first that Jesus wouldn't be contradicting the Old Testament because God's okay with polygamy in the Old Testament, and therefore he'd be okay with it later on. So Jesus must be talking about something else.
Right. So I guess I want to make the point that not everyone had multiple wives in the Old Testament. Like this was something God wanted.
Oh, right.
Right. So there are instances where it was how it was originally intended. And then like discussing what's the difference between toleration and like a command or something God wants us to do or something.
Well, there's also like with a lot of these examples, the women are actually the ones who are pushing the marriages, right? That the plurality of wives, because they're okay, well, I can't have a child like with Sarah. And instead of waiting for God's promise, it's like, okay, well, here, take my servant. Right? It's like you're getting all of this, like, or the competition between Rachel. I always confuse Rachel and Rebecca. Rachel and Leah.
Yeah.
Right. And it's like, okay, who can give him the most sons? Well, you take my servant and you take my servant. And it's just like this like ongoing competition for heirs.
Yeah. Yeah. Laban tricks Jacob into getting 2 wives. He's not really wanting 2 wives. He just wants Rebecca.
Is it Rebecca? Why am I
Rachel? Sorry, Rachel.
It's Rachel, right?
I just did the same thing. Rachel. Joseph is obviously he's in captivity, so he's got a couple wives there. He's Sarah pushes Abraham into receiving his her handmaid. So yeah, it's not through very good means. But one of the things that I think these guys miss is that they're trying to do a prescription thing, but they're actually trying to do it the wrong way. They're actually trying to do it to where the narrative is showing that because God gives children and blessing through these things, that he approves of them, that these are things that God wants and they're the ideal. And I would argue that if you understand the context and theology of Genesis, is that even though men do what they're going to do, whether it be good, neutral, or evil, God's still going to do good through it. So by the end of the book, you have Joseph's brothers throw him into a pit, and great blessing comes not just upon Joseph, but upon his brothers for throwing him into that pit. They're saved through a famine. They saved their whole family that way. God blessed them. Now, kidnapping and selling off into slavery gets the death penalty in the law. So we know that's evil, what they did. And literally the text says what they did is evil, because Joseph says, you meant this for evil, but God meant it for good. That's the theology of Genesis. The theology of Genesis is not, hey, if God blesses you when you do evil, then whatever that thing you did is good. So, if you don't have a child and it's only you and your dad, then get them drunk and sleep with them, and then God will give you children, because that's what he did with Lot and his daughters. It's like, yeah, that is not the way to read it.
Well, or in a modern context, I mean, how many people are getting pregnant out of wedlock? So God's okay with fornication?
Yeah, exactly.
Clearly not.
Or adultery. Look at all the people that, people are blessed with a child through adultery. It's like, well, yeah, God's purpose is to fill up the world to come. And this is part of the theology of Genesis too. Genesis is teaching that this is not the world that God is making. This is the world that God made. Genesis literally says this in, I think it's chapter 1, that God actually made the world. He created these things to make it. He created the world to make it. Meaning he made the world to make it. And you're like, he made the world to make it. What does that mean? It means that this is the world that is the intermediate thing that he made in order to make the world that he means to make. And so his point is he wants to fill that world up. So in whatever thing is fruitful and multiplying that he can use to be fruitful and multiply, he's going to use it. Whether it's a sin, whether it's his ideal, whether it's not the ideal, whatever it is, he's going to use that. Now, the things that are not procreational, those things get the death penalty immediately. And they're against the law, and they're put in the law as you get the death penalty. But if things can be procreational, even if they're not preservational, as we see in Genesis, like, what is divorce? Well, it puts Hagar and Ishmael, an offspring of Abraham, in jeopardy. They're going to die unless this angel intervenes. What is prostitution? Well, Tamar uses it so that God brings about offspring to Judah that eventually will be in the offspring or give birth to the Messiah. But clearly prostitution is seen as shady and bad and something that's dirty that Judah shouldn't have done and all that sort of thing. And polygamy functions the same way. It's something that God is not what God made in Genesis 2. It's not his ideal. He didn't make more than two in Genesis 2. It's just Adam and Eve. And the two become one flesh there by implication in the Hebrew. And then that's drawn out by the Septuagint translation and picked up by Christ, that it's only two becoming one flesh. That's his ideal. But is he going to use the others because they can be procreative? Of course.
It seems like
to argue that they're okay, though, or God's ideal is totally it's ignorant of what Genesis is arguing.
It seems like the argument that the polygamist makes or could make is actually very similar to arguments that are made for divorce and remarriage. It's like, well, we live in a fallen world, and so God makes allowances because of the world that we live in. So it's not the ideal that was set forth in the beginning, but God will make an allowance for it. You hear this all the time when it comes to divorce and remarriage. It's the same argument.
Well, and you hear this sort of like, is God really going to, condemn a person to not have sex their whole life if they can't remarry? And these guys will do the same thing, right? It's like, is God really going to condemn a guy in a marriage who, maybe his wife is injured and she can't have sex anymore or whatever? So God's going to condemn it. I mean, why not just take another wife then? It's the same sort of argumentation that tries to make you feel bad. It's an argument from emotion eventually. I mean, or ultimately, but it tries to make you feel bad for even suggesting that God has restrictions on something that would, cause you to sacrifice and miss out in your life.
I think when you look at redemptive history and how God is revealing himself through his people and through the evil that they intend, but the good that God brings out of it, as we get closer to the cross, you see what righteousness and justice looks like, the whole purpose of the Mosaic law and protecting women from men that are going to be evil, right? That are going to take multiple wives and potentially not take care of one or let one die or, fall out of favor with one or something. And especially when we look at like Jeremiah 31, this understanding of the new covenant and people being made after God's own heart or having having God's law written in them. There's this understanding that it's God's people will understand the original intents of what God is doing in Genesis 1. And that they are actually here to help make, as you just said, Brian, God made this to make the earth, right? So we're actually partaking with him in that sense. And these things, we look back in these things and say, oh yeah, that was never the intention. This isn't a prescription. This is what God tolerated for the sake of his people so that they exist and they're creational, because there is an alternative that would allow the people to die out because of just their sin and their hatred towards each other. And that's one of the reasons why the Mosaic law is obsolete, by the way, because now we are made in the image of Christ with his mind and are subduing the earth as he intended from the beginning. So, having this argument where divorce is also prescriptive, as April pointed out, that's what proponents of divorce and marriage are going to say. Well, Moses allowed it, and that's what the Pharisees said. Look, Moses lets us divorce for any reason. It's like, yeah, he did, because you guys are evil. But now I'm here. A new kingdom is here. A regeneration is upon you, right in your face. My people aren't going to stand for that. They're actually going to go back to the original intent of marriage, which is to cling to your wife and subdue the earth.
Well, yeah, these guys will go on and they'll be like, wait, God considers it adultery, but he didn't tell anybody for so many years. Would God really do that? And I'm like, wait a minute, are you arguing against Jesus? Because he literally says that. Yes. He literally, they'll be like, well, Jesus is talking about divorce. He's not talking about polygamy, which we'll address in a minute. That's ridiculous. But even just based on what he says, he literally says, what I'm telling you now, if this happens, then it's adultery against Moses, not just against their interpretation of Moses, because he says Moses wrote this because of the stubbornness, basically, of you, that you were stubborn. That's why Moses wrote this. He doesn't say, oh, well, Moses just meant this, and I'm in continuity with Moses. No, he's saying, he's saying Moses wrote this for a reason, but it was not so. What was not so? That you could divorce like Moses indicated you could. Like, it was not so from the beginning. So Jesus is contradicting Moses and saying, yeah, God looked over that sin and didn't express to you that it was adultery, because his emphasis was on the being fruitful and multiplying. And so he didn't apply it to that yet, because you weren't technically, you were guilty of one aspect of adultery. And I think this is important to get out, but not the other. There's two reasons adultery is wrong. And I think this is why it's repeated twice in the law, right? So it's repeated once as you're not to commit adultery, and it's repeated again as you will not covet your neighbor's wife. And one has to do with the fact that she's a possession of someone else, and that's the one that God doesn't enforce in the Old Testament when it comes to divorce and remarriage, polygamy, and prostitution. So the ownership thing, in terms of, the man belongs to the woman, and then there's only one woman that he has and all that, he doesn't enforce that, doesn't apply it in that way. Instead, what he does is he applies it to a married woman who's already married. So the strict understanding of adultery, and he applies it to the sexual immorality of adultery. That is, that you will not plant your seed, as it says in Leviticus 18, in the womb of your neighbor's wife and therefore defile it, meaning you'll render it useless for the husband because you've done it already or whatever. So those things are still condemned in the Old Testament, but those things both have to do with a married woman. So in the Old Testament and in the ancient Near East, adultery just has to do with a married woman, and that's it. And that's all God enforces. When Jesus comes along, now he's going to enforce the ownership issue and then say, basically make it to where, look, not only do you own your wife, but your wife owns you. And because you become one flesh, you cannot have anyone else enter into that. Otherwise, it's adultery. So Jesus expands it now, but God looked over it for those reasons in the Old Testament. Now he's expanding it and saying, this was always God's ideal. And you can see this in the very beginning. The two become one flesh, and you can't separate them, and you can't add to them, because then you have other things like, believe it or not, like, because the Levitical incest laws work on the one flesh union. If you sleep with your father's mother or father's wife, you're sleeping with your father. Well, what happens if a woman is brought into your marital union and she sleeps with you, but you're one with your wife? Isn't that lesbianism? So now you've got same-sex marriage going on through that as well. And so ultimately, these things are things that God overlooks, but now that it's been revealed, look, no, it's a one flesh union, and therefore you can't do this. That is an argument against polygamy, however you want to say it, and therefore against divorce and remarriage, and therefore against looking upon a virgin to lust after her when you're married, and therefore against prostitution, and we would say therefore against pornography, and all of that. If you're gonna wipe that away and you're gonna say that polygamy or polygyny is still okay, it's just divorce and remarriage that Jesus is talking about, then there's no law against prostitution. Then there's no law against that would prohibit pornography. If you separated the masturbation, if there was no married woman involved or whatever, then pornography would be fine. And yet that conflicts with other things in the New Testament that indicate that it's not fine, that they're actually evil things, that false teachers teach that it's okay to participate in those things. And so there's just a huge inconsistency, which is why none of these guys argue from the New Testament. Their whole New Testament spiel is that's not what that really means. That's not what that really means. That's not what that really means. But there's no positive case for that, because the New Testament is that the ideal is going to be your elders and deacons. And what are they to be? One woman men. It doesn't even say they're just to have one marriage. One woman men. They're to have one woman. That's the type of men they are. That's it. They just have one. And what does Paul say in 1 Corinthians 7? Let each man have his own wife, meaning she's not shared by anyone. And the polygamist would be like, oh, great. Yeah, we agree. But then he says, let each wife have her own husband, meaning he's not shared by anyone.
Yeah, like she has the rights to his body. So how?
Right.
So then he can. So multiple women can have rights to his body. It makes no sense.
No, it wouldn't be her own then, right?
Yeah.
Because she's sharing then.
I've heard this guy that with like the one woman man thing, he'll say, well, it's
just for elders.
No, he actually doesn't say that. He says it's like if you had a requirement, for a job that you were going to take, and the job said, you need to own one car to be able to, complete this job. Yeah. And so you need at least one. So it's like, okay,
at least one.
So then I guess you can't be an elder unless you're married.
So the guy writing it is not qualified. The guy with the ultimate authority, who is the elder of elders, is not qualified.
Because he doesn't have at least one car.
Yeah.
I mean, wife.
Yeah.
It's like, cars and women, it's the same thing.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's a one woman man, not a man that has one woman. Right. So it means that what characterizes him is that he has one woman. He would no longer be characterized that way if he had two women. So it's not even reading it correctly from the Greek and understanding that it's a characteristic of the man. He only has one woman. It's not that he gets a woman or something. It's literally that what characterizes him is that he only has one.
He's confused by a lot of words. Like he's confused by what the word Christian means. He thinks he is one.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. I want to go back real quick because many might push back with the idea that Christ is contradicting Moses, and it's just one covenant and it's just being revealed more and more, or something like that. They're all connected, right? None of them end; they just move on in different forms or something like that. And I want to say, like, okay, well, one, you have no understanding of covenantal theology, and unfortunately, most people that believe that call themselves covenantalists, right? Or that they believe in covenantal theology. But like even looking at the food laws, and I know some Hebrew roots movement guys will argue against this, but I think it's very clear up until the Mosaic Law that there was no objective unclean animal, right? There's nothing that's just like unclean,
right?
That God has made, but they're unclean to the Israelites, right? For you, they're unclean, so they're gonna represent sin to you as they make this covenant in Sinai. So God is making new rules really each time He's covenanting with His people, and He makes rules when He covenants with David, and He makes rules for Himself and for Abraham when He covenants with Abraham. So this idea that Christ's coming and this is a new covenant. Right, this isn't something that is continuing on or adding on to the Mosaic covenant. It is something completely new. So of course He's going to come and say, as redemptive history is coming to a close in the last age, this new covenant is forming my people, and they're going to be completely different because, well, the nature of salvation is different now, as far as the Spirit dwelling in His people and all men coming to Him of all nations and stuff.
Well, look to how it's new as well. There's two things in how it's new, right? It's new in terms of not only are you not to murder, but now it's expanded to hate.
Right.
Not only are you not to commit adultery, now it's expanded to divorce and remarriage. Now it's expanded to whether you look upon other women who are not your wife when you're married and you're committing adultery in that. It's expanded. It's not the same thing. So what would be the expansion of being faithful to God's original ideal in being fruitful and multiplying through what? Well, what did he originally set up? Well, the expansion would be monogamy instead of polygamy. You would think, oh, it would go the other way. Expansion would be, oh, more women. But actually, no, the more faithful would go back to the original means of being fruitful and multiplying, which would be through your one wife.
Yeah.
And so that's the expansion. The other way is that there are laws that that are in conflict with that now, and conflict with the new covenant, that you no longer obey in the Mosaic Law Code. And if not, then all of us are damned, because we're all still in our sin, because Jesus sinned. Because when he came across that Canaanite woman, the law ordered him to kill her. And instead, he saved her life and her daughter's life. He's supposed to kill Canaanites and their children, not save them.
Right.
And so Jesus did the opposite of what the law told him to do. And I would say that even before he knew that she had faith, right? She didn't even he calls her a dog, but he doesn't like get up and slaughter her. And so I'm just saying, it's again, people who want to say this monocovenantalism, to where, the law is the same in the new as it is in the old, and therefore everything's the same. And yet, if you say to the same people, now it is interesting when I watch some of these debates with these polygamists, the other guys who were Orthodox would say, like, do you think pornography is wrong? And they had a hard time saying that it was.
Really?
And they asked him, do you think prostitution is wrong? And they had a hard time saying that it was.
Wow.
Because ultimately, that's where it leads. If you don't understand that Jesus was condemning polygamy in the passages that deal with divorce and remarriage, and therefore divorce and remarriage are no longer permitted, then the logical following of that would be that, well, he didn't condemn the other things that are associated with the fact that you can have more than one woman. If you can have more than one woman, what's wrong with lusting after another woman? You can have that other woman.
As long as she's not married.
Right. What's wrong going to a prostitute? They're not married. You can have that woman. What's wrong with any of these things? There's nothing wrong with it. What's wrong with divorce and remarriage then? And I don't mean just for your couple of issues. What's wrong for divorce and remarriage for any reason at all? Because you can have multiple women if you want. It's ridiculous.
Well, the other thing it screws up too is the whole idea of who Christ is married. So Christ is called the bridegroom, but to whom? Is he a bridegroom of many women? Because marriage represents like attaching yourself to a God, right? So you marry, this is why God is saying don't marry the pagans, right? You're like, because you're bringing their gods to you, and that you will go after their gods, and you will, right? And judgment will come upon you. So this idea that marriage is actually showing who you're allied to, or who your allegiance is to, who you're connected to. Christ being the bridegroom, if Christ was a polygamist in the sense of his salvific work of multiple women, this would look to like multiple religions. Well, there's plenty of ways.
Universalism.
Yeah, then there's plenty of ways to God now.
Yeah.
Because Christ didn't marry the church. He married the church here, and then he's got this other wife over here. And then all of a sudden, this relativism and this universalism kind of makes sense, because Christ is ultimately a polygamist too, because marriage is picturing who Christ has unified himself to. And it's not just one woman, I guess. It's not just the church. It's everyone else as well. That doesn't work.
Well, if you're certain kinds of dispensationalists, he might be a bigamist.
Well, sure, I guess he's married the Jews and does something with them.
Right. Israel's a separate Gentiles. Group, and yeah. But obviously we don't believe that. We believe they're the same, so.
Right. I'm curious if any of those polygamists or dispensationalists, if that has any connection.
Oh, I'm sure it's somewhere in the background. They were at one time and have assumptions like that. I mean, but you know what's fascinating is that I heard the divorce and remarriage argument that we hear, that God divorced Israel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And therefore, and then he went on to another woman. And therefore God himself is a polygamist. And so that's the idea, and therefore, who's
the other woman that he went off to?
I think the other
Israel's
nations,
sister,
in terms of
Israel.
The church and all that, and because he divorced Israel. So again, it is a dispensational idea that like he divorced Israel and he now is with the church. And you have that even in some covenant theologians, you have the idea, well, he divorced national Israel,
right?
And now he's with the church, and it's like, well, the nationality part is people are being divorced, not a national conglomeration or something. Like that's not what he's divorcing. He's divorcing the people, and then he immediately takes them back from the exile, which is what that's all about. So he immediately has them return to him. He immediately restores the marriage with those people. So he never does that. But I just thought it was interesting that it's the same argument that, see, he has more than one wife, which you have to conclude if divorce and remarriage is okay, you can have more than one wife. That's the whole point. I tried to argue this with people who are like, well, we believe in divorce and remarriage, but we don't believe in polygamy. And it's sort of like, but you do, because you are saying that if the two become one flesh, you're one flesh with that woman. And now you're divorcing with a piece of paper and you're going off and becoming one flesh with another woman while that woman's alive. And same thing with men and whatnot. Like ultimately,
do they think that one flesh union is somehow broken?
Oh, I mean, I'm sure they do, but even well, the problem is that if they believe the one flesh union is broken, every time you have sex with someone else, because that's what they were arguing with adultery, it breaks it, then you can then say that you can just continually have sex with multiple women because you're never really unified with women. Yeah, it may be a sin in the moment, but you're never really one flesh that remains one flesh. But that's not the way the New Testament presents it. It says, while, when talking about the woman, for instance, the one flesh union is even when she's joined to another man, she's an adulteress because while her husband lives, not while she's married to him with a piece of paper, while he lives, she actually is one with him. It's only if he dies that's broken. And so if the one flesh union is only broken when you die and you can get divorced and remarry, then you can have more than one woman. And even we're arguing you can have more than one man on the women's part.
Right. And I think Romans 7 is very helpful with this because, again, Paul uses that as the analogy for the gospel itself, right? You dying to sin and being united in Christ, but like your flesh is dead, right? You have to die. So like, this one flesh union, and of course, like even in the Reformed world, people get around that by saying, well, they would be dead if we lived in a just society or something. They'd be put to death, right? So we're just going to count them as dead. But the problem is like, no, this isn't a spiritual death. You can't just attach the garden death to these men. Like, no, this is actually flesh. Like their flesh is alive. This is
right. The flesh. Metaphor actually, like, it's important when you're calling something flesh. Like it means something. It's not a throwaway.
It's a single physical union, not a spiritual union. You can be spiritually unified, like David and Jonathan are spiritually one, right? They're one spirit. Right. I mean, that's a description of friends, not your mate. Like your mate description is you're one physical entity with your mate. So that's very different. So that has to be broken in order for you to be able to then become one flesh with someone else legitimately. Yeah. And so if it's not, then it doesn't matter. You can't do this sort of like, well, you're spiritually dead. And it's like, no, you're not physically dead though.
And you can see God's, because, if we look at God's law as what binds all the covenants together, which I think is true. If there's any thread through the covenants in their distinctions, it is that it's God's laws in all of them, right? But when you have the Mosaic law is almost like a tapestry or a facade that's like covering the law of God or God's law, and because of men's wickedness, right? So like God's laws throughout it, like men need to take care of their wives if they're going to marry multiple. They can't let them die. They have to be fed. They have to have their rights, their conjugal rights, all that stuff. Their children have to be taken care of, all that. But once Christ comes, all that stuff that stuff like melts away, and what you have left is the true intention of God's law, which is again going back to his original intent for the universe, for creation itself. So like it's not an argument in saying that the Mosaic law is God's law, and this is what they argue, right? So
right,
Mosaic law is God's law. There's that's what it is. It's like, well, no, it's threaded in there, but it's covered by other things because you're wicked.
Because it's very clear that when Paul talks about Mosaic law, he says we're not under the law, but then he's like, but I am under the law of God. And it's like, oh, wait a minute. I guess the Mosaic law is not the law of God then. They're not one and the same thing.
They're not one and the same thing.
And so one of the arguments these guys were using is that, well, where there is no law, there is no sin, because the Mosaic law is God's law, and it doesn't outlaw polygamy, and therefore God's okay with it. And to which I would then respond, it doesn't outlaw prostitution. It doesn't outlaw pedophilia, not because God's okay with those things, but because you're to make inferences from other scriptures. And by the way, the Bible's not just the Old Testament, we have the New. So we're to look at the entire thing and make inferences from it, and therefore say, oh yeah, pedophilia, that is 100% wrong. You should be put to death for that. And yet we don't have a law. And yet God's law, which is higher than the Mosaic law, would say, no, by inference of the law of love and how you loving God and how you treat the being fruitful and multiplying and all of that, by inference, you would put them to death for doing that. And same thing with the other things. You, by inference of looking at everything, you'd be like, oh, okay, so God's law is really that you have your own husband and you have your own wife, and there's no one else in that one flesh union. It's just you two. And when Israel didn't obey the ideal because they were off with prostitutes or they were divorcing and remarrying, then ultimately that was not seen as a good thing. And neither was it when they were off doing the polygamy thing. God used it. He used it to communicate ideas, like, telling David, I'm going to give you a bunch of, I would have given you more wives, which, by the way, that wives in a royal context communicate power. Mm-hmm. They communicate the power of the king. This is why when Ahasuerus sees Haman like prostrated on Esther, he already thinks that Haman has kind of undermined his power. And then he walks in and sees that. He's like, are you kidding me? This guy's trying to steal my power by taking my wife, and that's immediate execution, because it's an idea of power. That's why Absalom sleeps with David's wives on the balcony, so everyone can see, I have the power. I'm the king now. So that's what it's communicating. So God will use it for those things, and he'll use it to be fruitful and multiply. But is it what God ultimately wants? No, because his son, who is his image, the image of the invisible God, has one wife. And that is the one we're to mimic, and we're to have one wife, and that's the way it was in the beginning. That's God's intent. And so every Christian who follows Christ should have one wife, and that's it.
And what a disgusting twisting of Christian liberty to use that text where there is no law, there is no sin, which is supposed to be like, hey, if someone doesn't like smoking cigars, you don't have to smoke one ever again, because you have the freedom as a Christian to actually love that person. Like that. It's like, what a how more satanic can you be other than
it's a complete misunderstanding, right? Because is Paul saying that like there was no murder before God said thou shalt not murder?
Right.
It's like, no, the point is that sin is an active rebellion against what has been revealed to you to be against the will of God. But there also what is inherently known within you, that things are not the way they should be and they're wrong, even though you don't have a command. Paul's just saying there may not be sin, there's trespass the whole way. You're constantly over God's line before the law, before it's revealed to you, and that down deep, and you should understand that. And there are people who are clearly evil, even though God didn't say, hey, murderers are evil, everybody, before the Noahic law code. And then after the Noahic law code, you don't have anything about adultery. And yet people, somehow it makes its way into everyone's law, whether Hammurabi or Lipit Ishtar, like you cannot have someone else's wife. And everybody knows that. And so, like, obviously things that are just not spoken in the law, it doesn't mean that God's not against them. You have to figure that out by looking at the whole counsel of God over time. And comparing that to basically the law within. Obviously, the law within gets corrupted over time, so you can't rely on that, which is why I think God eventually does start spelling them out. But again, the Bible is not the Torah. The Bible is the entire thing. And we have to interpret the Torah in light of Jesus, who is higher than the law and the prophets, which is why you have the Mount of Transfiguration. You've got Moses, you've got Elijah, who represent the law and the prophets. And what does the Father say? Hey, listen to the law and prophets, everybody. No, they say, no, this is my beloved son. Listen to him.
Yeah.
He's the interpreter of the law and the prophets.
All right. Well, thanks for watching. So if you want to support us even more, we have a Patreon right there. Follow us on Patreon, and you can join the Rebellion or the Empire. I can't remember which side we're on, but you can join the Star Wars universe with us and be nerds. So do that, and we'll see you next time. Peace.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Haven't read the series, might not understand what would need to happen.
Have you read all of them?
I've read all of Frank Herbert's novels. Yes.
Oh, you've read all of them. I've only read the first one because my grandma told me that the other ones were bad.
Let me just start with this. Frank Herbert is not a good storyteller. Not a good storyteller. He's a fantastic world builder. By Morgan. I am your only future. But they don't like they're bred for war. So like Saruman like literally grows them in his
in like his vat.
Yeah, in his
orc
vats,
vat.
Right? And he like gives a sword to him and they go fight. That's like, and Uruk-hai are like better than the original orc or whatever because they can be in the daylight.
The reason why I like Moby Dick so much is, to me, there's a parallel with Genesis. So it's actually history. It's history that Melville he's interviewed. This actually occurred to a bunch of whalers.
Yeah.
And the survivors he interviewed.
Yeah.
And it became this book. But notice how he's writing this history. It's not, here's all the facts that happened. All right, the end. He's writing it because he wants to put meaning and a message to what has occurred.